Good evening. How are you? I hope everyone is still in the game. I suggest you drink a glass of water, stretch your body, and stay still because we are yet to uncover and explore more on the field of linguistics. I am Mr. Steve Trosio Corsino, and welcome to my class. Our topic this evening is discourse and interactivity. So these are our objectives. First, explore relationships between individual interactions and discourse as wider concept. Second, provide an overview of some of the approaches traditionally taken to the analysis of talk. And lastly, show how new technologies are disrupting conventional ideas about spoken and written modes of communication. Now let's discuss first what discourse is based from our previous lesson. Well, discourse is a spoken language. It can be a form of expressions within a group demonstrating shared knowledge. Discourse can be a widespread and repeated ways of talking, writing, thinking, and behaving, and therefore ultimately ways of being in the world. Now, what are the coverage of discourse? A discourse is a spoken language which could refer to a single instance of communication between two people. It can also be a shared understandings within a group are likely to involve several people. Discourse can also be for something to cross a whole society. Frequently, occurrences of repeated patterns in different contexts are required in discourse. However, despite these differences in scale, the three aspects are interconnected. Now let's discuss first what little d discourse and big D discourse according to G in 1990. Well, according to G, discourse with little d refers to a particular instances of communication. This can be everyday conversation and communication. Now let's take this example. Tom, it looks good. Joey, I like it too. Now without context, how do we know what they're talking about? Now without the context also, do we know what the main idea is? Or without the context, do we know the what, when, and where? Now while discourse with capital D, these are talk that has connections to larger contexts rather than only to a specific information cued by the definition of a phrase. Now, discourse with capital D is defined also as the combinations of saying, writing, doing, being, valuing, and believing. Now, example for this. Tom and Joey are at the restaurant looking at the menu. Joey, what about this dish? Tom, it looks good. Joey, I like it too. Now with context, we know that Tom and Joe are at a restaurant. They are talking about food. And that with context, they both like the food. Now let's take this example number 2. Discourse with a big D. So without context, we say angry Native American, or bad items on the ship, or piracy. We do not know what the main point of these sentences without the context. However, if there's a context, we say upset American colonists, protesting unfair taxation, beginning of revolution from British Crown. So with context, we know the way and how the action took place. Now let's proceed with the interactivity and spoken language. But let us differentiate what monologue is and what a dialogue is. Now monologue, it is a speech given by a character to express his or her thoughts and feelings to other character to the audience. But it's a mistake to say that this speech is simply a one-way act of communication. Now let's take this example. Imagine that you are giving a talk and people in your audience are stretching and yawning, looking up to the ceiling and intermittently shaking their hands. You might justifiably feel that they are communicating strongly despite their not having uttered a single word. Well, dialogue It refers to a conversation between two or more characters in a work of literature. It involves two or more characters. Now, what are the strategies for monitoring listeners' level of attention? Example, using questions or formats such as, "Are you with me?" or "Do you know what I mean?" So these are what we call monitoring features. Meanwhile, listeners can give speakers reinforcement to help them continue. Example, or "Yeah," or "Really?" or "Never." Next is conversational analysis, or we also call them a CA. So this approach to the analysis of spoken interaction, known as the conversation analysis, developed from the work carried out by Harvey Sachs, Gail Jefferson, and Emmanuel in the early 1960s at the University of California. So conversation analysis is analyzing a dialogue as a way to understand how social interactions or relationships were enacted. Conversation analysis could also be, it looks at ordinary everyday spoken discourse and aims to understand from analysis of the conversation and how people manage their interactions. It is an approach to study of social interaction, embracing both verbal and nonverbal conduct and situation of everyday life. Now, adjacency. It refers to how cohesion works in speech. It is a sequence of two related utterances by two different speakers. They help in opening and closing a conversation, so they may refer to negotiate ideas or deals and change topics. Example of adjacency: questions and answers, requests and compliance or refusals, offers and acceptances, mutual greetings, and so on. Let's take this example. Tom, would you like a drink? Andy, what's on offer? Tom, tea, coffee, water, fruit juice. Andy, do you have any green tea? Tom, yes, I think so. Andy, I like a green tea, then please. So that's a conversation analysis. If we're going to apply cultural context for that, we would ask ourselves, who are these two men and why are they meeting up? What is green tea and who drinks it? To what extent is this interaction a norm? Is this the way everybody would exact or enact this kind of hospitality routine? Now let's proceed with interactional sociolinguistics, framing and phase. If the project of conversation analysis is to discover some generalizable facts about interaction management, interactional sociolinguistics starts almost from the opposite, drawing on sociological and anthropological traditions to focus on the behavior of specific communities and contexts. It is not a single approach or tradition, including, as it does, many different threads. Now, contextualization cues according to John Gompers. This is a discourse signals that show how speakers are understanding the nature of the context that they are in, including the relationship with others in the ongoing dialogue. Now, there are some social factors that affect our language or that affect our language use. First is the social background. This may referring to the education, social class, ethnic group, etc. Next is the relationship between the speaker and the receiver, whether you are friend, family, or employer, etc. Next is the context and manner of interaction, the when, where, how the act of language occurs. Now, these factors have significant effects on the way we use language in our daily interaction. And the way we use language with our friends is not the same as that we use with our employer. For example, if we request to bring something, if we are as friend, you say, "Can you bring the book?" But with the employer, you say, "Would you bring the book, please?" So the relationship between the participants affects our language use. So social linguistics, in other words, is a field of inquiry that scientifically studies the relationship between language and society. That is how social factors affect our use of language. Now, contextualization conventions. This is a concept that uses a visual metaphor to describe a linguistic one. Visual metaphor, according to Gumbers, is a picture frame where putting a frame around something identifies it as a painting or drawing, setting it apart from whatever is outside the frame, wallpaper, paint, concrete, etc. So visual metaphor in language use, the idea is that speakers give each other clues about how they understand the interaction they are in, thereby drawing an imaginary frame around their interaction and defining it in a particular way. Now think of those times when you were using a form of digital communication and you wanted to make sure your interlocutor knew you were joking. You may have added an emoticon or another form of expressive language to show that your message needed not be taken too seriously. Now, frame analysis, according to Goffman 1974, it helped shape the subsequent work of generation of researchers. Focus on framing involves exploring speakers' understandings of the type of interaction that they are in. Now, Goffman's face theory, he sees the face that we present to the world as having to be managed, and as with the idea of face that see life as performed action. Now, example, saving face, not being shamefaced, putting on a brave face to the world, losing face, not being able to face things or face up to things, facing down a threat, having someone in your face. Now, politeness, according to Goffman's face theory. Politeness refers not simply to everyday forms of etiquette such as saying please and thank you, but to more fundamental ideas about the appropriateness of language choices and how they relate to social conventions. Now let's proceed with speech acts, conversational maxims, and pragmatics. Now, speech act theory is the attempt to explain how speakers use language to accomplish intended actions and how listeners determine an intended meaning from what is said. Now, it is a subfield of pragmatics concerned with the ways in which words can be used not only to present information but also to carry out actions. Now, this was proposed actually by J.L. Austin from the book of How to Do Things with Words, and it was supplemented by John Searle. Example of speech acts: swearing an oath in a court of law, saying I do at a wedding ceremony, and saying I name this ship at a lunch, are all meaningful actions if performed by the right people in the right context. The speech act theory. Locutionary act. This is the act of saying the literal meaning of the utterances. A locutionary act is the extra meaning of the utterances produced on the basis of its literal meaning. Per locutionary act, the effect of the utterances on the hearer depending on the specific circumstances. Now let's take conversational maxims. Conversational maxims is actually discussed by Paul Grease. He was born on March 30, 1913 in Birmingham, England. He is a linguistic philosopher, educated at Clifton College, then at Corpus Christi College in Oxford, and he taught at UCAL, Berkeley. Now, conversational maxims, according to him, are guidelines that one should follow when speaking. It regulates how the message is being conveyed. Communication determines the effectiveness of the conversation. Now, the maxims are broken up into 4 subcategories: maxims of quantity, maxim of quality, maxims of relation, and maxims of manner. Now, these are the maxims of conversation. So, maxims of quantity, it gives enough information but not too much. Maxims of quality, be truthful based on your contribution on evidences. Maxims of conversation relevance is stay relevant to the topic. And maxims of manner, be clear and perspicacious, avoid ambiguity and obscurity. Now, variation analysis. To trace patterns of variation across groups. So that's the synchronic patterns. Variation analysis could also be to trace patterns of variation through time, and that's referring to diachronic. When we say synchronic, it is a descriptive linguistic, studies language at one period of time. Now let's have this example. Analysis of dialects or various spoken differences of the English language in London, such as Scouse, Yorkshire, and Cockney English. Now diachronic, historical linguistics. It is a development of language through time. So example, evolution of French or Italian from Latin or Hindi from Sanskrit. Now let's take linguistic prestige. In social linguistics, linguistic prestige is the degree of esteem and social value attached by members of speech community to certain languages, dialects, or features of a language variety. Now examples and observations. Old English certainly had words for language and female and face, and we could perfectly well have carried on using them. But the much greater prestige of French induced many English speakers to introduce French words into their speech in the hope of sounding more elegant. Now, over prestige, it describes the type of prestige associated with established official power. Now, covert prestige, it describes a more hidden status that is associated with figures of resistance or alternative power. Now, interactivity and written language. Now, let's ask this question. Can written language ever be interactive? It may seem odd at first to suggest that written language could be interactive. But if the idea of interactivity is based on the idea of two-way communication rather than communication that occurs in real-time face-to-face context, then it may not appear so strange. So I hope you have learned something. Again, I am Mr. Steve Trosio Corsino saying thank you and good evening.